I remember the night she died with a clarity that still chills me. The rain was hammering the windows of the small hospital room, and the machines hummed with the indifferent rhythm of life running out. My husband wasn't there. He had left hours earlier, after taking a phone call that was apparently more important than holding his mother's hand in her final moments. His sister never came at all. And so it was just me, a 40-year-old woman, who had always been more of a shadow than a daughter-in-law, in their eyes sitting beside the frail figure of the woman who had been both my tormentor and, in some strange way, my silent confidant. I wish I could tell you I felt love in that moment, but the truth was more complicated. My mother-in-law Holly had never made my life easy. From the first day I entered the family, she looked at me with the sharp eyes of someone measuring a garment that didn't quite fit. I wasn't good enough for her son, not polished enough, not ambitious enough, not connected enough. She wanted someone who could match his world of expensive dinners and whispered business deals. Instead, he married me, the quiet girl from a modest family who knew more about libraries than luxury. And yet, as her breath grew shallow and her eyes flickered open one final time, I realized she had chosen me to witness her departure. The irony wasn't lost on me. I reached for her hand, the skin paper-thin veins blue against the pallor of her flesh. She whispered something so faint I had to lean in close. At first I thought she was calling for her son, but no. Her words were for me. Check the drawer. Those were the last syllables she ever spoke. I sat frozen, unsure if I had heard correctly. The drawer. Which drawer? Was it nonsense, a slip of a mind unraveling at the edge of life? But then her hand went limp in mine, and the final exhale left her chest. Just like that, Holly, the formidable matriarch who had ruled our family gatherings with arched brows and cutting remarks, was gone. And I was the only one there to hear her last words. The hours that followed were a blur of paperwork, nurses, and silence. My husband returned briefly. His tie loosened his face, carrying more annoyance than grief. He muttered something about arrangements and inheritance, about how his mother had never been sentimental anyway. I wanted to scream at him, to ask how he could be so cold when I was still shivering from the weight of her final whisper. But I swallowed the words as I always had. In his world, my voice had long ago become background noise. It was only later, when I was back at the house, that her words began to gnaw at me. Check the drawer. I couldn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind seemed to carry her voice back to me. Finally, I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake the man beside me, who had once promised to cherish me, but now barely noticed my existence. I padded downstairs, the wooden floor cold beneath my feet, until I stood in front of the heavy oak desk in Holly's study. She had always guarded that room fiercely, never letting anyone touch her papers, her trinkets, her old typewriter. My fingers trembled as I pulled open the top drawer. Bills, receipts, a collection of fountain pens. Nothing unusual. The second drawer held photo albums, faces frozen in time, smiling children, vacations, birthdays. My husband as a boy, grinning with chocolate smeared on his face. His sister in a ballet costume. Holly herself, younger, radiant, before bitterness had carved itself into her features. And then in the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of faded envelopes, I found it. A sealed letter, my name written in her hand across the front. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the curves of the letters. Why me? Why not her son? Her daughter? Why had she chosen me, the one she criticized, dismissed, ignored, to carry whatever secret she had buried? With shaking hands, I tore the envelope open. The paper inside smelled faintly of lavender and dust. Her words sprawled across the page, steady despite the tremor I had seen in her hands during those final weeks. If you are reading this, it means I am gone. And if it is you reading it, means I trusted you in a way I never admitted aloud. They will mourn me with crocodile tears, but you, my dear, you know what it is to be unseen. That is why I chose you, because in you I see the woman I once was, and I will not let them erase us both. Look to the cottage. The key is taped beneath the drawer. I read the letter again and again, the words etching themselves into me. She saw me. She trusted me. It was a revelation. I hadn't expected a kindness wrapped in the bitterness of her life. I checked beneath the drawer, And sure enough, there it was, a small brass key, cool against my skin. I clutched it tightly, my mind racing with questions. What cottage? What secrets lay waiting there? And why had she hidden them from her own children? The next morning, the storm of inheritance began. My husband and his sister convened with lawyers, their voices rising over who deserved what, who had been promised this or that. I sat silently at the edge of the table, the letter burning a hole in my pocket. They barely acknowledged me, except when it suited their arguments. "She never really liked you," his sister sneered at one point. "Don't expect much." I bit my tongue, but inside something began to shift. For years I had endured their disdain. For years I had been the dutiful wife, the invisible daughter-in-law. But now I held a secret they knew nothing about. And it gave me a strange, dangerous sense of power. That night, while they drank wine and argued about antiques, I drove to the edge of town. The directions in her letter were precise, and soon I found myself on a winding dirt road, the headlights cutting through the fog. Finally, the cottage emerged, a weathered structure surrounded by overgrown ivy, the windows dark, the roof sagging but sturdy. My hands shook as I slid the key into the lock. The door creaked open, releasing a rush of stale air tinged with something floral, perhaps the ghost of her lavender perfume. Inside, the rooms were simple, almost austere. But as I searched, I found more letters, more journals, boxes of photographs. It was as if she had created a second life here, one hidden from everyone but me. And in those pages, I began to uncover truths that made my blood run cold. The cottage did not feel abandoned so much as paused, like a breath held between ribs. Dust floated in the air in slow galaxies, and the floorboards creaked with the careful shyness of a place that hadn't heard footsteps in too long. I set my phone on the narrow kitchen counter and let its weak flashlight guide me. Through the windows admitted a thin ribbon of morning gray. Holly had arranged the rooms with the simplicity of someone who had learned late to keep only what she could love. There was a single armchair facing a small hearth, an iron bed made with hospital corners, a shelf with sun-faded novels whose inside margins teemed with penciled notes. In that smallness, there was dignity, even tenderness. I felt it when I touched the back of the chair. The fabric was warm in some muscle memory of hers that my fingers could not know. The first box I opened was labeled only with a date 12 years earlier. Inside were photographs not of galas or charity luncheons, but of ordinary days Holly, in gardening gloves, with dirt beneath her nails. A pie cooling on the sill, a child's drawing. I recognized as my husband's, edges crinkled, a sun with rays drawn like many-fingered hands. On the back of the drawing, in her neat hand, she had written, "He said he doesn't need me anymore." I didn't know if she meant her son at 5 or at 40. With this family, those declarations had a way of repeating themselves across decades, like a curse that chose new mouths. Beneath the photos lay a stack of lined journals, each tied with twine. The first page I turned to had been written in the compact, disciplined handwriting I had seen on grocery lists and gift cards. When I was young, I believed love was a polite performance. I learned to hold my breath and smile. Every room had rules, every sentence had a price. I read that line twice and felt with a start. I didn't expect that she and I had been living parallel lives in neighboring cages. For years I had despised her for judging me with those flinty eyes. It never occurred to me she had first practiced that judgment on herself until it calcified into habit. I read until my legs ached from standing. Her entries were not confessions so much as transcripts of erasure. She wrote about a husband who quoted her ideas at dinner parties, accepting applause as if she were an empty chair. She wrote about children who learned that applause early and mistook it for love. Children who called when they needed the brightest check or the broadest alibi, and then forgot her name for whole seasons when her hands were empty. She wrote about the loneliness of a woman everyone believes has everything. She did not spare herself. There were pages about the small violences she too had committed to maintain the family's gleam, the cutting remarks to put rivals in their place, the charity photo ops that hid the fact that she had ignored her own mother's last phone call. She had been cruel once. She knew it. The knowledge did not absolve her, but it softened something in me I had thought petrified. Near the bottom of the second journal was a sealed envelope, brittle at the edges. Inside was a photocopy of a deed. I stared at the black stamp that made the cottage mine. Not a loan, not a trust. Mine. Beneath the deed, a notarized addendum dated 3 weeks before she died. If the deed's transfer was contested by her heirs, the cottage would fall under a separate will kept in the office of an attorney whose name I did not recognize. My stomach clenched at the word heirs. I could see already how the news would land across that long dining table at the house, blame like lightning, accusation like thunder. It wasn't the property itself that made me afraid. It was what the cottage contained, the fragile archive of a life she had hidden in order to survive the one everyone else demanded she perform. In the third journal, I found the first undeniable twist. It was a short entry written in a hand shakier than the others, dated the year my husband was 17. He didn't come home last night. The police found him at the lake with friends I don't know. When I asked why he didn't call, he said, "You wouldn't understand. He is his father's son. He knows how to erase me with a sentence." And then 3 pages later, pressed so hard the ink bled, I found the letter in my husband's briefcase. He has a daughter. She is 7. Her name is Ava. I closed the journal. The cottage seemed to tilt under me. A daughter. A child grown in the shadow of a marriage presented as flawless. I thought of my own husband's insistence that appearances were not lies but manners, that Holly's stiffness was a symptom of old money's obligations. I had believed him in part because I needed to, in part because it was easier. Now, in the quiet of that room, I understood something that had once been opaque. People who are trained to perform seldom know they are performing. They only know the terror of the audience's silence when the act is done. I read on, moving my lips without sound. Holly had confronted her husband and lost. He promised discretion and delivered exile. She wrote of the pact they made. She would keep the family intact publicly if he severed the other tie privately. It sounded like a treaty signed under duress. With one clause she wrote in a fury across the margin, "If they ever try to erase me, I will choose my daughter-in-law and give her the stage." The pronoun struck me in the chest. Choose my daughter-in-law. It was not yet me. It was a blank line she would fill with whoever stood on the other side of her son's marriage. A future vow made not to a person, but to a role. She had looked down the hallway of time and left a door open that I would someday walk through, hesitant, clutching my own secrecy like a key. I looked up, tears burning that I didn't want. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to protest that it was unfair to make me the vessel of her last acts, unfair to press into my hands the detonator she had been too heartsick to use. But then I remembered the hospital room, the way she had chosen me with the last breath she had authority over. If love is a performance, maybe inheritance is the curtain call. You hand the next person the lines you never were allowed to say. By the time I left the cottage that afternoon, the rain had given up, and a brief, watery sunlight washed the field. I locked the door with the brass key and slid it on a chain around my neck, tucked under my shirt, like a confession. In the car, I stared at my reflection. I looked like I always had, careful, composed, a woman who said, "I'm fine," on autopilot, even when her chest was a hive. But my eyes were different. There was something expectant in them. Or maybe it was a kind of grief that had finished being a victim and was deciding what to become next. At home, the war had already begun. My husband's car angled crooked in the driveway, his sisters parked behind it like a blockade. Inside, they were at the kitchen island with a bottle of wine and the brittle laughter that means cruelty is on the hinge. When I stepped in, their conversation snapped shut like a trap. He gestured toward me with the back of his hand as if directing a server. His sister smiled without teeth. It was our old choreography. We all knew our steps. I set my purse down calmly, the journal's weight still thrumming in my wrists, and poured a glass of water. The urge to tell them everything rushed up, wild and hot. Instead, I swallowed it. Power is sometimes knowing when not to speak. The will reading took place 3 days later, in a paneled office that smelled faintly of leather and lemon oil. Holly's attorney was a woman about my age, with a voice like a cello. She did not perform sympathy, she performed precision. She opened a thin folder, glanced at each of us in turn, and began. To my husband and his sister, Holly left personal items, photographs, jewelry, a ring that had belonged to her grandmother. To a handful of charities, she left modest sums. The estate's primary home was to be sold, and the proceeds donated to fund a program for caretakers of the elderly. My husband blinked hard as if he had misheard. His sister made a sound I had only ever heard once before when she found a scratch on her imported car. And the cottage, my husband asked, attempting a charm that felt moth-eaten. The attorney folded her hands. The cottage was transferred prior to death. It is the property of your mother's daughter-in-law. She turned her eyes toward me as if passing a flame. There was a hush in the room that did not belong to law. It belonged to ritual, to the ending of one inheritance and the naming of another. My husband's jaw worked. His sister's face reddened in a slow, fascinating bloom. I felt the heat rise in my own throat, then cool, then settle like a stone. The attorney slid a second envelope toward me. I recognized the unflinching slope of Holly's handwriting. She asked that this be read privately if possible, the attorney said, and for the first time a thin strand of something like gentleness crossed her tone. I waited until I was alone in my car to open it. The letter was short, written with the economy of a woman who had been wasteful with everything except words. If you are reading this, it means the cottage is yours. Inside, you will find the record of what they took and what I returned to myself in secret. You will also find a file labeled Ava. Give it to the attorney when you are ready. They will hate you for what I have done. That hatred would have found you anyway. Choose the version that lets you sleep. I drove back to the cottage as the sky bruised into evening. I do not remember the turns. I do not remember the radio. I remember only the way the key slid into the lock like an answer. In the bedroom closet behind a row of hanging cardigans, I found a metal box labeled in her tidy way Ava. Inside were copies of letters mailed, but never replied to, photographs of a girl whose face rearranged my husband's features into a new genealogy school certificates, a lock of baby hair in a tiny envelope. There was a notarized acknowledgement of paternity signed by Holly's husband. There was also a draft of a letter to my husband dated 4 years ago, never sent. You have a sister. I did what I could with what your father made of me. You can choose to do better. Choose. I understood then what Holly had given me and why she had chosen me. The cottage was not a jewel, it was a fuse. The journals were not keepsakes, they were testimony. The file was not gossip, it was a summons. If I delivered it, the family story would split along a new seam. If I hid it, I would become the next woman to swallow her life to preserve a lie. I thought of how my husband had left the hospital before his mother died, of how his sister had weaponized absence into sport, of the way they were already rehearsing outrage because property had slipped their fingers. I thought too of the nights Holly must have spent at this very table, choosing a future she would never live to see. On my way home, my husband called. He asked where I had gone with the weary patronization of a man counting down to anger. I told him I was at the grocery store and would be home soon. I said it kindly. It frightened me how easy the kindness was. I was not preparing to fight. I was preparing to reveal. There is a difference. A fight aims to win. A revelation aims to end. When I finally slept near dawn, my dreams were crowded with doorways and corridors, but every room led back to the cottage, that small square of earth where a woman had stored her last truths like winter fruit. When I woke, I knew what the next days required of me: the slow gathering of allies who valued truth over performance, the careful handing of evidence into hands trained to protect it, the quiet refusal to be baited by theatrics at the dinner table, where, as always, the silver glinted like small knives. And still, even with purpose stitching me upright, the grief remained. Not just for Holly, not just for the girl named Ava, but for the wasted years in which we all played our parts so perfectly that we almost convinced ourselves the script was real. I wondered if betrayal is always less an event than an atmosphere, a barometric pressure that drops so gradually, no one notices until the storm is already upon them. I had noticed now. I could not unnotice. The day after the will reading, silence became a new kind of weapon in our house. My husband moved through rooms like a storm contained, his footsteps sharp against the hardwood, his voice clipped when he addressed me. His sister called often, her shrill tone filling the air even when I didn't put the phone on speaker. I overheard her once hissing, "She must have manipulated Mother. No way Holly would leave that to her." My husband didn't correct her, he didn't defend me, he never had. But beneath their accusations, I carried a secret far heavier than the cottage itself, Ava. The child no one acknowledged, the sister my husband never knew, or perhaps had chosen not to know. I carried the evidence of her existence like a burning coal in my chest. Every time I looked at my husband's face, I wondered how much he truly knew, how much he had inherited, not just wealth, but denial, cruelty, the ease of rewriting truth when it suited him. I couldn't tell him not yet. To reveal Ava would be to light a fuse that could not be extinguished. And though anger burned in me, though betrayal had carved deep canyons through my trust, I wanted to choose my moment carefully. I spent more time at the cottage in the weeks that followed. Each journal drew me deeper into Holly's life, and through her words I began to see the brittle armor she had worn at family dinners, the reason her eyes had always looked past me as if I were furniture. She had been protecting a secret while despising herself for keeping it. She had been drowning while appearing regal. One evening, as dusk spilled purple across the fields, I found a tape recorder tucked inside a shoebox. The cassettes were labeled with dates. My hands trembled as I pressed play. Her voice filled the cottage, steady, weary, unflinchingly honest. They will call me cold. They will say I was harsh. But no one will admit how silence was forced upon me, how I learned to use sharpness to survive. Margaret, if you are listening, it means you found me. It means you are stronger than they will ever allow you to believe. Do not give them your silence. I sat there for hours listening to her unspool her loneliness into magnetic tape. Each confession was another crack in the facade of the family I had married into. By the time the tape clicked off, tears streaked my face. But there was something else too, a rising conviction. She hadn't just left me her property. She had left me her story, her voice, her unfinished battle. The next Sunday, the family gathered for what they insisted would be a discussion. I braced myself as I entered the dining room, the chandelier glaring down like an interrogator's lamp. His sister started immediately. "This is absurd. That cottage should be ours. You're nothing but an outsider. Mother never even liked you." I met her eyes and for the first time didn't look away. Maybe she saw something you didn't. My husband slammed his glass down. "Enough. Give it up, Margaret. Sign it over and this whole mess will be done." I thought of Holly's voice on that cassette. "Do not give them your silence." I straightened my back. No. The cottage stays with me. That was her choice. The air thickened with disbelief. His sister sputtered insults. My husband's face hardened into fury, but I remained calm. Inside, though, my heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. They didn't know what else I held. They didn't know the name Ava or the power nestled inside that metal box at the cottage. That night, when my husband stormed off to his study, I sat alone in the kitchen. For years, I had been invisible at that very table, serving meals, listening to their voices, fill the air while mine dissolved. Now, for the first time, the silence felt different. Not empty, but charged like a bowstring drawn, waiting to release. I reached for Holly's letter again, rereading the words until they burned into my memory. Choose the version that lets you sleep. What version could I live with? One where I gave in, remained small, surrendered the truth so they could remain comfortable. Or one where I bore the storm, unveiled everything, and risked being hated forever. I knew the answer, because I had been hated already and survived, because silence had already cost me too much. The following week, I scheduled a meeting with Holly's attorney. I brought the metal box with me, my hands sweating as I placed it on the polished desk. She opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the documents, the photographs, the notarized statements. When she looked back up at me, there was no surprise in her face, only solemn recognition. She trusted you, the attorney said quietly. And now the question is, will you trust yourself enough to follow through? I nodded, though inside I trembled. I will. But the truth I realized as I drove back to the cottage that evening was that revenge is not a single act. It is a slow unfolding, a revelation paced by the rhythm of your own courage. And I wasn't finished yet. Because the day was coming when Ava's name would echo through the halls of that house and nothing would ever be the same again. The morning I decided to reveal Ava's existence, the air outside felt charged like the moment before a thunderstorm. I stood at the window of the cottage, clutching the photograph of a girl whose eyes mirrored my husband's, though softened by innocence. Holly's journals were spread across the table, the tape recorder still beside them, silent now, but heavy with truths that could never be unsaid. I whispered her name aloud, Ava, and it felt like lighting a match in a room soaked with fuel. The family had demanded another meeting, this time at the attorney's office, because the estate division still gnawed at their pride. They couldn't accept that Holly had chosen me, the outsider, over her own children. I knew that when I walked into that room, their fury would be waiting like sharpened knives. But I also knew something else this time. I was the one carrying the blade. When I arrived, the air was already thick with tension. My husband paced near the window, his jaw tight, his eyes cold. His sister sat with her arms folded, nails tapping against the polished wood of the table. The attorney entered calm as ever, carrying a folder that seemed ordinary enough, but might as well have been a detonator. She began with formalities, reiterating the terms of the will. My husband cut her off. We've heard this. We're contesting the transfer of the cottage. Mother wasn't in her right mind. His sister nodded vigorously. The attorney's gaze flicked toward me. I slid the metal box onto the table, its weight echoing in the quiet. Before you continue, I said softly, you should see what your mother left behind. My husband frowned. What is this? I opened the box and laid out the documents one by one, the notarized acknowledgement of paternity, the letters, the photographs of Ava through the years. Each paper landed like a stone in still water ripples spreading across their carefully constructed narratives. What the hell is this? My husband's voice cracked, anger and confusion warring in his tone. He picked up one of the photographs, staring at the girl's face, then at me, then back at the picture, as if it might rearrange itself into a lie. It's your sister, I said, my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart. Your father had another child. Your mother knew. She kept the proof here, waiting for the right time to make sure the truth wasn't buried with her. His sister snatched a letter, eyes scanning the words before slamming it back onto the table. This is forged. It has to be. The attorney interjected, her tone calm but firm. The documents are authentic. They were notarized, recorded, and preserved by your mother herself. This is not fabrication. This is history. Silence fell heavy and suffocating. My husband's face drained of color. He sank into a chair, holding his head in his hands. His sister cursed under her breath, fury twisting her features. I looked at them both, the weight of years pressing down on me. She didn't trust you with this. She trusted me. Because she knew you'd rather cling to a lie than face the truth. She chose me because she knew I wouldn't stay silent. My husband looked up, eyes glassy. Why didn't she tell me? Why didn't she? His voice broke but then hardened again. This changes nothing. That cottage should still be ours. The attorney's voice sliced through his denial. On the contrary, this changes everything. Your mother documented not only her intent but her reasoning. She left her estate in a way that acknowledged the pain of her life and the family's betrayals. Contesting this will not only fail, it will expose these truths publicly. His sister's eyes widened with fear. Public exposure was the one thing this family could not bear. Image was their altar, their god. I could see the calculation in her mind, the realization that pushing further might cost her far more than a cottage. I gathered the papers back into the box, my movements slow, deliberate. You called me useless, I whispered, my voice carrying more strength than any shout. But she saw me. She gave me her truth. And now you can hate me all you want, but you can't erase what she left behind. The meeting ended in fractured silence. My husband stormed out first, his footsteps echoing like gunfire down the hallway. His sister followed her heels, clicking sharp with rage. Only the attorney and I remained. She reached across the table, her hand resting briefly on mine. You did what needed to be done. Don't doubt that. That night back at the cottage, I lit a fire in the hearth and sat before it, Holly's journals beside me. I thought of the years she had suffered in silence, the sharp mask she had worn, the bitterness that had shielded her from being erased entirely. I thought of Ava, a girl who had grown up in the shadow of secrets, her life tethered to a family that had never claimed her. And I thought of myself, the woman who had been called useless, dismissed, erased, until the moment Holly handed me her voice. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was carrying her burden. I felt like I was carrying her torch. But even as the fire warmed my skin, I knew this was not the end. My husband would not forgive. His sister would not forget. Their hatred would sharpen in the dark, waiting for an opening. And yet I was no longer afraid, because once the truth is spoken, it cannot be buried again. And in that truth I had finally found my power. The days after the revelation blurred into a strange calm. My husband barely spoke to me, drifting through the house like a ghost. His footsteps heavy, but his eyes hollow. His sister stopped calling, retreating into her silence, though I could almost feel her rage pulsing through the distance like a storm waiting to break. For once, the house felt less like a battlefield and more like a tomb full of echoes that had nothing left to hide. I spent most of my time at the cottage. It had become more than a secret retreat, it was a sanctuary. Each time I unlocked the door, the air welcomed me like a familiar embrace, the scent of old wood and lavender reminding me that Holly's presence still lingered, not as judgment but as witness. I cleaned the rooms, tended the neglected garden, opened the windows to let sunlight spill across the faded rugs. Slowly the place came alive again, as if breathing with me. It was there that I began to read Holly's journals, not as confessions, but as lessons. She had written of her mistakes with brutal honesty, the pride that had kept her from reconciling with her own estranged mother, the silence she maintained to preserve appearances, the cruelty she sometimes inflicted out of fear of being diminished. But woven through those pages was also a desperate yearning for truth, for connection, for someone to remember her as she really was. And I realized in her final act, she had chosen me to remember. She had chosen me to carry forward, not just her property, not just her secrets, but her humanity. I thought often about Ava. Somewhere out there, she lived her life unaware of the storm her existence had set into motion. Did she know who her father was? Did she know the woman who had kept her memory safe in a cottage full of journals and letters? My hands itched to reach out to find her, to tell her that she was not forgotten. But I hesitated. To bring her into this family's line of fire might be to wound her all over again. For now, I chose patience. When the time was right, when the path was clear, I would find her. My husband confronted me only once after the attorney's meeting. He stood in the doorway of our bedroom, his face drawn, his voice ragged. "You've ruined everything," he said. I looked at him calmly, years of swallowed words rising now with clarity. "No, I revealed everything. There's a difference." He had no reply. He turned and left the door, clicking shut behind him like the final line of a play. A few weeks later, I filed for separation. It wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no tears. Just a quiet acknowledgement that the marriage had long since died, and only its corpse remained. He didn't fight me. Perhaps he was too tired. Perhaps he knew that his mother's last act had already shifted the ground beneath us, in a way he could never undo. As the papers moved through the courts, I poured myself into restoring the cottage. Neighbors I'd never met before came by curious, offering help. I learned that Holly had once been kind here, away from the mansion and the parties. She had taught a few local children to read, baked bread for a widower down the road, donated quietly to the small-town library. In this place she had not been the cold matriarch I had known. She had been simply Holly, a woman searching for redemption. I decided to honor that version of her. I transformed the cottage into a small refuge for women like me, women who had been dismissed, silenced, erased. We met in the evenings, sitting by the fire, sharing stories that had been buried too long. We cried together, laughed together, rebuilt ourselves in the safety of that little house. I named it Holly's Haven, not just for her, but for every woman who had ever needed a place to be seen. Months passed. My life, once a performance of quiet endurance, became something else, something I had never dared to imagine. Free, whole, mine. On the anniversary of Holly's death, I lit a candle at the cottage window. I poured a glass of wine and whispered into the flickering light, "You are not forgotten." For the first time, I felt that those words applied to me as well. I was no longer the useless wife, the invisible daughter-in-law. I was Margaret, survivor, truth-bearer, builder of something new. If you've listened to my story, if you've walked with me through betrayal and silence, through secrets and revelations, then I ask this of you: remember that your voice matters. Don't let anyone erase you. Don't wait for someone else to validate your worth. Claim it, speak it, live it. And if this story touched you, if you found a piece of yourself in these words, please like, share, and subscribe. Leave a comment with your own truth, because your story deserves to be heard too. Together, we are not forgotten.